I am pleased to be able to talk to Dr. William Myers today. Dr. Myers is professor of New Testament and Black Church Studies at Ashland Theological Seminary. He is also director of the Black Church Studies program. And Bill, you've been doing that for over 30 years, is that correct?
37 now.
37 now, okay, wow. Dr. Myers he's a leading innovator in the Black Church Studies program. He did bring it to Ashland Theological Seminary, including our Black Church Studies track in the Doctor of Ministry program. He is also founder of the McCrary Center for African American Religious Studies in Cleveland. And if that weren't enough for Bill to do, he is also pastor at New Mount Zion Baptist Church in Cleveland. So Bill, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for taking some time out to speak with us. So I'd like to start by asking you a question. And this is directed at you because you're professor of New Testament, and I know that you've looked at these issues deeply from a scriptural standpoint. There are many Christians, especially evangelicals, who do not see social justice in biblical terms. They see it basically as a political issue, often one that should be avoided. So as professor of New Testament and Black Church Studies, as a pastor and a leader in the Black Church, help us to understand why so many Christians do not see justice as a biblical issue, and give us a quick lesson on why social justice is central to the scriptures from your perspective.
Well, thank you, Matt, for the privilege and the opportunity to do this, and to especially do it with you. I reflect back on when I started at Ashland, and you and your brother Alan were students in my class, but your father came to a number of my classes. I can't remember now whether he took them for credit or he just wanted to take classes. But I'll never forget that in that class, here's this older gentleman compared to the students that was always asking me about social justice questions, far more than the younger ones were. And so I'm very happy to do this with you in these many years since then, 37 years ago now. I don't know why white evangelicals or any evangelical or any student of the Bible would not see justice as central to the Bible, the Christian faith, and to discipleship and being a follower of Jesus. How one reads the prophets, especially the prophet Amos and Micah, how do you read that and not see that justice is central? Let justice roll down like waters and an ever-flowing stream, Amos 5:24. How God is upset with them. You have fixed the scales. You sell the poor for a pair of shoes. God was always concerned about issues of justice. Take, for example, the Genesis 19 story where so many have focused on the sexuality issues of white. There was this great question for many years. You could look it up now and find many, many articles that tried to answer the question, why did God destroy Sodom? What was the reason? And many have looked at sexuality issues there, but one closer to it, one of the prophets said it was because of the treatment, how they treated the poor. And then when we move on over into the New Testament, Jesus himself, Luke 14 and 16, 18 and on, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. You have anointed me to preach good news to the poor. And I think that somebody's trying to call me. Let me fix that.
Yeah, as I said, we lost your video.
Yeah. Let me get this off here.
There you go.
Okay, I'm back. Somebody was trying to call me for some reason. Two key things in there that deals with justice is I've come to preach good news to the poor and to set the oppressed free. How is that not about justice? My dear friend that just died just last year, Dr. Kane Hopefeld, a New Testament professor at Princeton for a number of years, and then for the remainder of his tenure, over 30 years at Howard, did his dissertation under the great late Raymond Brown, Johannine scholar, on James. And his entire dissertation on James was about justice, the various forms of justice that James talks about. And Jesus's entire life, all of his sermons, Sermon on the Mount, and all of the things that he did, and trying to teach his disciples who were not getting it, feed the hungry, clothe the naked. I used to ask my students in class, what's going to be on the final exam when you meet the Lord? And everybody would talk about all of these doctrinal kind of things. I said, well, you know what's interesting is Jesus says something about that in Matthew 25. And there's not one doctrinal question in there. They're all, how did you meet human need kind of questions. They're all justice kind of issues about prisoners, about the hungry, about the sick, and the inequities in all of that. And why we get so caught up in doctrinal issues and think that that should be our total focus and not the issues of social justice, socioeconomic justice. Let me give you one final one as it relates to your biblical question. I for a number of years in my career at Ashland, I taught the Corinthian correspondence because my focus in the New Testament was the Pauline corpus. I taught the Corinthian correspondence, and I argued with my students that 1 Corinthians 11, 17 to 34, as opposed to being a pietistic ritual matter in terms of the Lord's Supper, certainly it can be seen as that in many of the Gospels. But I argue that in Paul, it is a socioeconomic matter. Paul is talking about how the well-to-do are acting around the Lord's table. This is just not no regular table. This is not a table at your house. This is not the way the thing goes out there in society. this is the Lord's table, and dare you socioeconomically shame those who are poorer by eating up everything or eating the best because they work the lower jobs, get off later, and then come later. And those of you who are better off have done this. So there's socioeconomic justice right there in the Corinthian correspondence.
Very good. Thank you, Bill. You know, you mentioned Jesus reading from the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue, and it seems obvious that he is firmly placing himself within the prophetic tradition that we find in the Old Testament, and that within his ministry, that the people that he defends time and time again are those who are considered outcasts, those who are powerless.
Yes.
And that is who Jesus always takes up their cause.
James Cone argued in his book, God of the Oppressed, that God is always on the side of the oppressed, no matter who they are.
Yeah. Well, thank you. So, one of the reasons that I had reached out to you and asked you if you would speak with me is because of the current situation we're experiencing in the United States. You know, we are currently in the middle of a pandemic, which we know is disproportionately affected African-American communities in the United States. And on top of that, we have watched these horrible videos of the killings of Ahmaud Arbery by a couple of white men who were self-appointed vigilantes. We've seen the killing of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police officer. And of course, then the protests and the renewed calls for systemic change. You know, Black leaders have been telling us repeatedly that all of these events are part of a system, that is a systemic injustice that is going on, that there is a connection between all of this. And yet there are many white Americans who do not see the connection. They do not, so to speak, connect the dots. So could you talk to us a bit about what is the grid that connects those dots, and why is it so hard for many white Americans to be able to see those connections?
I think one of the most telling passages of scripture for me in the Gospels is that encounter Jesus first has after he has received his commissioning, his calling, and he's in the wilderness, and at his most vulnerable point, Satan encounters him. Now, Jesus is without a doubt a very privileged person. He has all kind of power. And at every turn, however, he rejects the use of that power and depends instead upon his Father and the Holy Spirit. Power and privilege is very seductive. And if you aren't careful, no matter who you are, once you get it, one, you don't want to give it up. Two, you just kind of forget when you are exercising a privilege that you've always had that others did not. This country overlooks the fact that for 400 years, African Americans have been disproportionately at every level, socioeconomically, health, assets, privilege, and every way you can talk about it, have been disproportionately disadvantaged. So we were take food. We were forced to eat the things that whites did not want and left for us. When I was a kid, growing up in the South, in Mississippi, you know, I ate chitlins, pig feet, pig ears, what they call South meat, all of that stuff that was the leftover and not the best of the foods. And so we were given the cheaper foods, the foods that was not as good for you. And so we developed and passed on high blood pressure, diabetes, you know, obesity, and a whole series of health issues. And then we were not paid for our work of building this nation, the wealth that we should have had to pass on. We were not, so we were left in poverty. And even after the Great Migration to the North, we were in the ghettos. And so poverty just wreaked havoc upon our people. So we, not only back then were we not allowed to go to the doctors, we would not be seen by a white doctor. We didn't have the health care that we needed. And we didn't have the money to go see them. So all of these things kind of spilled over. So the racism that was heaped upon us was done, it was multifaceted, multidimensional, and it affected us in so many ways. This has been going on for the longest. COVID is what unmasked it, uncovered it, and brought it out so that everybody could see it. So, you know, you look at, we were denied proper education. I had to walk 6 miles to school in Mississippi, past 2 white schools, on over the hills and down into the valley to West End Elementary School. Black kids had to go there. We had all the secondary kinds of things. And so educationally, at every level, we were denied to vote. You got to remember now, the Civil Rights Act didn't pass until '64, and the Voting Rights Act didn't pass until '65. So we were dealing with all of those kinds of things, and they were affecting us on so many different levels without the privilege. And so those that had the privilege, they just never even thought about it. In some instances, this is a privilege that I've been used to.
Yeah, you know, of course, General Sherman was famously supposed to have said after the Civil War that every freed slave would receive 40 acres and a mule.
Yeah, which we never got.
Which, of course, never happened. But it speaks to the lack of resources that Black Americans have just systematically suffered from.
And Martin once said, someone who's running on a paved track and this other person who is running on ground up cinder. And the person running on the paved track is saying to the person running on ground up cinder, why can't you keep up?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that it's very apparent to me, and I'm sure I'm not the only one, is that we often use a lot of different terms with a lot of imprecision and a confusion. Terms like racism, systemic racism are often confused with terms like prejudice or bigotry. So how can you help us understand how those terms relate to one another?
Well, I would say this. Connotatively, there is no difference. They are synonymous and they are used synonymously. Mm-hmm. Now, denotatively, denotatively, you go look up what does Webster say about it. But connotatively is how does it work itself out in life? What's the larger baggage with it? I don't think that there's much difference in it. Denotatively, the way scholars like to talk about systemic racism is that it's institutionalized. It's part of systems. It's part of cultures. So let me give you an example of what's going on now with this matter of police brutality. I hear people say all the time, there's just a few bad cops and all of them should not be broad brushed with the few bad apples. And I started to challenge that and ask people, when you say the vast majority of cops are good, I said, well, define for me what you mean by good. So let me ask you this question. If a cop is standing there while another cop is carrying out a criminal act, it's obvious that it's a criminal act against a citizen. Brutality is going on, assault, and he is silent. Is that what you mean by a good cop? Then all of a sudden the conversation changes, because what I'm trying to get people to see is this. The police culture, it's a culture. The blue code is a culture. And I've started to make a comparison with the NRA, and I'm calling police, NRA too. We thought after Columbine, this will never happen again. Then there were all of these others, of which I bet you it would be hard pressed for me to get someone to name 5 of them. Aurora in the movie theater, okay? And then we get to Sandy Hook, where little children, 5, 6, 7 years old, are slaughtered. I mean, this is going to change this. This is going to change the whole narrative. The President, Obama, goes there to meet with the families, and he gives a presentation, and he is crying publicly. This is going to change it. The families go to Congress. This is going to change it. Did change it. We've had at least 2 dozen known. I landed in Las Vegas. If I had landed 10 minutes earlier, if I had been on time, I would have been right on that street when that shooting was going on. So we went on from that. Then we get the children back in the school. And so the children got together and they said, we're going to change this. And they started marching it. Does anybody know where the children are now? How many we've had since then? It is a systemic culture. It's a systemic evil. It's been indoctrinated. We talk about our rights as it relates to guns so much that it is hard to take that down. And there's so much money behind it. Now, I'll say this one about the police culture. What racism did in this country, and a lot of whites knew what was doing. It wasn't that everybody was ignorant and it was just privilege and they didn't understand the prejudices, the biases, the bigotry. What it did was it helped to create a culture that said, you can do this to Black people and we'll look the other way because we are so afraid of them that you are our line of defense of them coming to hurt us. I think that's the thing that shook the nation when they saw this cop. It wasn't that it hadn't been done before. It was done to Eric Garner. It was done to others. But they saw this cop with his knee on this man's neck, pleading for his life, looking into the camera like, so? Nothing gonna happen. Because white America has made it clear to policemen, even now with videos, I go ahead, shoot a man in the back, North Charleston.
Yeah.
The jury didn't convict him.
Yeah.
There's some federal stuff. The jury didn't convince Eric Garner. So even with the videos, it has not changed. That's the difference between systemic. It's just wrapped up into all of our economic systems. The 1% has more than the bottom half of the whole nation. It's just wrapped up in our system. The political systems, they're bought and paid for with the money. The educational system, it just does not help in favor of the poor. So that's the major difference, I would say, with systemic racism and just the plain term racism or bigotry or prejudice. Now, on the matter of prejudice, that's a broader term because I'm prejudiced against pumpkin pie. I'm definitely prejudiced against that in favor of.
Well, I'll take your slice, pie. Bill, because I like it.
I'm prejudiced against baked chicken over fried chicken. So that's just a broad term prejudice and biases than racism and bigotry and systemic racism.
Yeah, I think that, part of what was behind that question for me is that there are, I think, a lot of white people who hear this talk of racism and systemic racism, and they hear prejudice, and they think to themselves, well, I'm not prejudiced. I work with Black people, or I work with Latino people, and I eat lunch with them, and I like them, and I don't have any bad feelings about them. And so they don't see the issue because they don't experience the systemic part of this.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I would like to ask you just one more set of questions, and I really did not want to leave this conversation without asking you to tell us a little bit about your own experience, which you have already done, and I thank you for that. But talk to us a little bit about what it has been for you to experience America as a Black man. Tell us about maybe one or two experiences that you've had that really have been definitive for you And then following that, given the current situation, what are your hopes and your dreams for your children, your grandchildren, your congregation?
So let me pick out some in terms of periods of time. When I was a child growing up in the 40s and the 50s in Mississippi, Meridian, Mississippi, the systemic nature of this was even worse than it is now because all the laws was on their sides. All the laws were against you. They could do whatever it is they want. Everything was separated. Black and white water fountains. You know, one seat in the back of the bus where you had to sit down, and they pulled a curtain in front of you, no matter how many of you was there, so they wouldn't even have to look at you. You pay the same price to go to the movie, but you got to go in the back door, the side door, and go upstairs. I could not go to a white person's house. I had to go to the back, and I couldn't even step up on the porch without hollowing out and asking if it was okay at the threat of being killed. I escaped the Ku Klux Klan at the age of 8 because it was a law in Mississippi. If a white woman is coming down on the sidewalk, and if you are a black man, and of course I'm 8 years old, what I'm gonna do to a full-grown woman? But you have to step off into the street and let her pass. So all of that stuff could have been defining for me in terms of my life and the hatred of black people or white people. But it was the church that I belonged to that taught what Jesus says. You got to love your enemies. And you are not defined by that. So fast forward now, I live in the southwestern part of Cleveland, one of the well-to-do suburbs of Northeast Ohio or of Greater Cleveland. I, in 1977, was the first black family to integrate this particular neighborhood. Gary Starr was the mayor, was one of our graduates at Ashland University, and I got to know him well. But this was a defining situation for me that changed me on a bunch of things. A lot of stuff had happened to us there. They burned a cross in my yard. They threw dead carcasses of rabbits and squirrels up on my porch. And so we just kind of endured a lot of stuff and kept going. But there was one instance when my son, who is now 40, was 2 years old. And we lived in a ski roof split house. And the one room was right over connected to the garage. It sat up the second floor. His bedroom was in there. And I had just let the door down. And thank God I had just let the garage door down, because it could have been way worse. Somebody threw some kind of huge cherry bomb-like thing. Had it gone in and up under the car, it could have been a very tragic situation. My son could have been killed and all. But as the door was going down, it hit and bounced off. But it was so big and so large, it shook the whole house. And my son woke up and was just terrorized and screaming. I grabbed my gun. I'll never forget this. My life could have changed there forever. And I would not be anywhere where I'm at now. My life could have ended then. I grabbed my gun after all that I had endured, and I come running down. There was this very nice white family that lived across the street that had 2 young boys. And we had gotten to know them, and they would come over and, play basketball in my yard and all. And the one, he was just a little fat, chubby kid. And just the most likable kid you'd ever want to meet. And I came out of the house. It was in pitch black. And I saw this person coming toward me. And I laid my gun on him like this. And he threw his hands up and hollered, "Mr. Myers, Mr. Myers, Mr. Myers, it's David, it's David, it's David." And I thought back, and I think about that to this day. If I had shot that boy, I would have changed his family's life forever. Maybe changed them from being white parents who were not prejudiced against Black folks to being so. I would have changed my family's life, because I'd have been in jail maybe for the rest of my life. Or certainly, I might have just now been getting out after 30-some years or something. And I got rid of that gun. Never picked up one ever since. No matter what the set of circumstances. It's like I had trained. This was back when I was younger. I had trained with the Ohio State Highway Patrolman. I had gone to the classes to just to be able to do this. In my early 20s, we owned a store in the neighborhood, and so our church did. And so I did that to help out. And so I had the training, I had the concealed weapon thing, and I had that same gun that I had to get in order to train and to pass that course. But I got rid of it, and I've never had one since. That could have been a defining time for me. So I go with Martin, no matter what. Martin said on a 60 Minutes interview, September the 27th, 1966, after we had all of these riots, and Mike Wallace asked him, "Martin, how much longer? How many more summers do you think that we have to endure this?" And Martin said, "Hopefully not long. Our people can't handle this any longer. We can't wait any longer for our freedom." And that's the time where people have quoted Martin that said, when he then asked him about rioting, that Martin said that it's the language of the unheard. It's part of that interview. But in that same interview, Martin said, I do not care if all 22 million then, Negroes, we were Negroes then, in America change and go to violence. I will never change. In the interview, he says, it's impractical and it's immoral. Now, maybe white folks shouldn't hear that. I don't know. Maybe white evangelicals shouldn't hear that, because we've more than a half a century later still talking about police brutality. But as for me, it's not only Martin's way, it's Jesus's way. And as to your question about hope now, I always try to give some reason for hope. You know, we all can turn to the end of 12 and the beginning of 13 in 1 Corinthians. Now abideth these three: faith, hope, and love, and the greatest of these is love. We try to give that. I do believe still that love, and Martin believe the same thing. Martin says, I won't turn to violence because I still believe that love is the most powerful force on the face of the earth. I still believe that. But I'm going to tell you something else that I believe, and why I believe that this is not going to change. I've preached 2 sermons recently at my church. The first one had to do with Genesis 2, Genesis 6, and Revelations 21. That said, God put man out of the garden and he put an angel there so he couldn't get back in. Because he had changed in a way that it'd be dangerous for him to get back in and to live forever that way. Then it says in Genesis 6, the world had become so evil that I repented that I made him. I'm gonna wipe out everything. Every creeping thing, even the birds of the air. Only Noah and his family gets to go. For those who believe, for some of us that believe that that's the way it was. I know some others believe it's like midrash and not true, but that I'm talking about what's there. And then there's 21, 1-5. I always wrestle with this as a New Testament professor. Why does God, I say, have to destroy it all? It says, destroy heaven and earth and make it new. I make all things new. Why couldn't he just fix it? And I came to the conclusion that, you know, you can work on an old refrigerator, you work on an old car till after a while, there's no more work that can be done. It has to be thrown out and get another one. Yeah. And that we're going to go all the way to the end doing this. And then my next sermon was on Matthew 24. And if Jesus had not shortened the time, there would be no flesh left. So it's like, if that's where we're headed, this is not going to change. It's so deeply within us. I've said that if Martin came back now, or if Martin was still alive, he'd be in his 80s. He wouldn't get a hearing down there. He'd be booed and jeered because we don't want to hear that. Yeah. We are angry and this is what we're going to do. And for those who did nothing, so you didn't want Kaepernick to take a peaceful knee. Mm-hmm. And now we get these young people who say, well, okay, we haven't been heard, so it's going to be violent. Then you get the militia in New Mexico who comes out and says, we're going to defend our stuff. I'm just afraid that this is headed towards civil wars all over the place. All we can do, because we have been mandated to do it, is to teach what Martin taught. But it is not just our responsibility as Black folks to help change this. We need white folks to help change this as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And we could just try to make it better, okay? But based on those scriptures I see, that's where we're headed. We are, as a creation that God made, we are just bound and determined to destroy each other as well as destroy his earth. See, we're not even just, it's not that we're just destroying each other. We're destroying the earth. We polluted the water. We polluted the air. We polluted everything. And yeah, God can't fix that. He got to get rid of it and make it new.
Mm. Yeah, you know, I've seen there's a cartoon that floats around on social media that someone is saying to someone else, I had asked God why he allows all this to go on. And God asked me, he said, I want to ask you the same question. You know, why do you allow this to go on?
Yeah.
And it does put the responsibility where it belongs. It can be too easy to blame God for it rather than to look in the mirror.
I think that the Christian church has to do more than we've done. And therein lies the problem, though, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
The Christian church is just as divided,
yeah,
conservative and liberal, on two different sides. And I understand people got their beliefs, and that's not going to get bridged either. People not giving that up. So as you asked me what this thing started, why don't they believe in social justice? I don't know. But I'm not going to give up on social justice either. So I'm not changing on that. Like Martin says, I don't care if everybody goes down the violence route. I'm not changing. And so there we are with the standoff, with the impasse.
Yeah.
God help us all.
Well, amen to that, Bill. Bill, I once again greatly appreciate you spending time with us, talking to us about this, and you know, appreciate your wisdom and just appreciate the ministry that you have had over the years and the ministry that you have had in the context of Ashland Theological Seminary and what you've brought to us. So thank you.
My pleasure.
And I hope to see you soon.